Welcome to this third episode of the webinar series on generative AI for development in HPC. My name is Nicolas Herman, and the presenter will be Geert-Jan Bex, also part of the project EuroCC Belgium. Like last week, these webinars will feature recorded demonstrations of using generative AI. And this third episode focuses on outsourcing the boring jobs. And there is a dedicated Q&A channel in the Teams meeting, so you can ask your question directly in there. And we will answer to the questions after the session. I just recall the project EuroCC, which is the National Competence Center in High Performance Computing, but also High Performance Data Analysis and Artificial Intelligence. And this is some of our tasks to help individuals to acquire some skills related to HPC. So let us go to discover how to generate code documentation. It will be split in two parts. And the first part is about generating Python documentation with ChatGPT.
One of the things we really dislike typically as developers is writing documentation. However, it's a quite important aspect of proper software engineering, so actually we'd better do it. However, at the moment there's a nicer option, and that's using ChatGPT in order to generate documentation for the code you wrote. So we asked ChatGPT to write documentation for a Python class and its methods. And we also specify that we want the side-by documentation style. So this is the class. It has an initialization method, some other methods, and so on. So let's see what ChatGPT can come up with for us. And as you can see, we get some very decent looking documentation. And there is even type annotations, although I would prefer them to follow more recent type hint standards, but regardless. Okay, so the ChatGPT provided some class level. No, something went wrong here, but that's just a matter of formatting. So for some reason it messed up a little bit with the annotation here. So basically the markdown it generated is not quite perfect. But apart from that, as you can see, the generated documentation is quite okay. What I dislike is basically the return type. I noticed somewhere like here, this list of int, I don't like that much. I would prefer modern style type hints. Let's see whether I can get ChatGPT to do that. So the editing is being done in place. And let's see, this is much better. So let's have a look. It's very interesting. Here it even has detected that the return type is a list of lists that contain integers. So this is really nicely done.
So this was the first part, and the second part is about generating the documentation with Doxygen in C++ with GitHub Copilot.
Now let's see how GitHub Copilot generates documentation, and in this case it's for C++ code, so it actually like Doxygen format documentation. Let's see what GitHub Copilot can do for us. So as you can see, we get indeed documentation in Doxygen format. We get a brief description of what this function does, and also its parameter. So that looks good. Let's try it for the next. And again, as you can see, we get both the parameter and the return value. In this case, there is not much of a description. So let's see whether we can get GitHub Copilot to do something in that regard. Okay, so that looks promising. And let's take another example. And again, we get a quite reasonable documentation string here. So, although this is not really ideal documentation, it serves its purpose as a starting point, which you can elaborate on later.
So this closed the part about generating documentation, and now we will focus on generating tests. And here is how to generate tests for Python.
You can ask ChatGPT to generate unit tests for a function or a method. So in this case, we have a method that applies to a member of a point class, and it takes two additional arguments which represent points, so P and Q, and also a relative tolerance. You can see the implementation here, and when we ask ChatGPT to provide us some unit tests, it's first going to do some reasoning in the sense that it checks which particular cases are relevant to test. So, for instance, whether the point is on a non-vertical line or a vertical line, whether the point is slightly off, depending on the tolerance, etc., etc. So basically, it does quite an interesting analysis of the possible things that can go wrong, even considering the edge case that P and Q are in fact the same point. So this is quite interesting. It generates some code as well, of course, and it does that using unit tests, which is a library, well, let's say a module in the Python standard library. And as you can see, it also helps us by creating a class, which in fact already exists, but it does the scaffolding for us in that respect as well. And then we get a number of test cases implemented in a class, which derives from test case, which is a base class in unit test. And as you can see, it covers all the cases it listed comprehensively. You get a little explanation, and you can try that code. Actually, I prefer PyTest over unit test, so I can ask ChatGPT to regenerate the code, but now for PyTest. Let's see whether that works. And indeed, this is in PyTest format. Each function that is a test starts with test underscore, and only the assert statement is typically used. And it even provides a little motivation of why I would want to use PyTest in the first place.
So this is on how generating a Python test. I noticed on the conversation that some people might have some problems with the playing of videos. If there is still problems, you can maybe mention in the chat to see if it's still the case and what are the number of people that experience those problems. And so yeah, effectively, I see on the chat that some could also launch the video by yourself. Normally it's synced with me playing the video, but we can experience some problem here. And now let's get into the second part of generating tests, which focuses on C++.
I have this class, and its instances can be used to keep track of descriptive statistics. So basically it's used in a streaming context. You simply add values as they come in, and at any time you can compute statistic measures, descriptive statistic measures such as the sum, the means, and the number of entries. So it's a very straightforward class. What I would like is to get some test cases for it. So I've uploaded the CPP file and the .h file to ChatGPT, and I'm asking it to generate unit tests for this class, but using the Catch2 testing framework. So let's see what it does. It switches to canvas mode, and as you can see, it starts generating test cases. So it also details in the chat what it is going to cover exactly while testing. So basically it will verify that the newly created class actually has the appropriate values at that moment, so 0 count and a sum which is equal to 0, and then it checks when we add a value whether indeed the count goes up and also the sum is computed correctly. Also note that it is going to use the approx of the Catch2 framework, so that's quite good, because this is a comparison of floating point numbers, which of course should not be done by just applying the equality. It also checks that the mean value is computed correctly. Indeed, for the values 4 and 6, the mean value should be 5. And finally, for a stats object that has no added value, it checks whether an exception is thrown if the mean value is computed, which of course would involve a division by 0 at that point. Since ChatGPT has spotted a weakness in our code, we can ask it to modify the code in order to properly throw an exception when division by 0 would happen. So let's see what it comes up with. It's now reviewing the test case code, which is not really what I want. Okay, it claims to have updated that, and indeed now we have a main method listed here, and that says, well, okay, if n is equal to 0, we get a runtime error. Mean is undefined for 0 elements, which sounds good, and otherwise it's just doing the computation. So this looks quite reasonable. It also includes the std accept header, which is perfectly fine. So that looks actually quite well.
This is the final part about test generation, and it's about bash functional testing. Here we go.
I have this Python script that monitors running processes and can report periodically on its memory consumption, its CPU usage, whether it has open files and which, the affinity, and so on and so on. And of course, such a file or such a utility is not necessarily easy to test, so it would be nice to see whether ChatGPT can come up with a shell script in order to test this script, do a functional test on it. So I'm asking ChatGPT to generate a bash script in order to test that monitoring utility. So I can upload the script. And notice that I'm actually not specifying anything about what monitor is supposed to do, so ChatGPT will have to figure that out from the code itself. Let's submit the query. Okay, so it details the steps which it will take, which seems quite reasonable. It starts a simple sleep process, then it runs monitor in the background. Okay, and then after a delay it terminates both processes and it checks whether the output contains output, and it prints test pass if so. Okay, we can copy the code and test it out. So I've saved the script to the file, and now I can execute it. And as you can see, the test passed, but of course this was a rather simple test in the sense that it only checked whether output had been generated or not. Whether that output is correct is everyone's guess. So basically we would have to refine this test a little bit. So I'd like a few adjustments to be made to the script. Let's see what ChatGPT comes up with. Okay, now it runs only for 5 seconds, but indeed it was kind enough not to kill the script, but rather to wait for its, the sleep command, but wait for its completion. So that's quite good. And then it also checks the PID, which seems to be okay. Right, we can try out the script and see what happens. So let's try out a new version. Indeed, it runs for 5 seconds and it has indeed checked for the PID, so that looks a bit better. But still, we want some more tests. One of the things I'd like is some more verbosity, and the other is also that it should check not only that the correct process was monitored, but also that the delay was actually respected. So basically the delta between each monitoring timestamp. So let's see what ChatGPT comes up with when I ask for these changes. So it does handle command line options. It even checks whether there is an unknown argument, so it does error handling, that's quite good. And then it defines a log function, which is indeed convenient. Okay. OK. Checks whether the monitor script exists. That's nothing new. It starts logging. Indeed, it runs for 20 seconds. That's quite good. It checks whether output is generated as before. Then it's validating the output, which is good. The test remains for the PID. It's also fine. Now it does a check on the timestamps. That looks very good. Okay, so again, this is something that we can try out and see whether it works in practice. So again, let's run the script and see what happens. So this is without verbosity. Okay, it has monitored the process and it respected the delta of 5, so that's good. Now let's test whether we can get some additional output. Yes, it's starting the process. It is printing the process ID, which it started. Now it's actually monitoring. And indeed, it's validating. PIG check passed, and indeed also the delta timing check passed. Excellent, so this looks like a pretty decent script without much effort on our part.
So this is it for today. Thank you, everyone. And like two previous one, this webinar is supported by the EuroCC project, funded by HPC GU and the European Union. And now we can switch to the Q&A. So we got some interesting questions. And the first one is about how does ChatGPT can handle yeah, the example were quite simple, and if Geert-Jan is with us, can maybe answer how, for example, handle some more complex codes.
Yeah, so basically, the point is indeed that if the complexity goes up, of course, the probability that large language models will come up with something decent goes down a little bit. That's something that we have to live with. That's just inherent to the technology which we use at this point in time. Now, of course, there are a number of ways in order to reduce those issues, to mitigate that problem. One of them could be to make sure that the large language model has as much context as possible. So basically, making sure that you either upload a number of files which are key. So basically, that would be your class definition. And then, of course, also make sure that things are kind of logically grouped, because most likely your code is modular. And essentially, of course, those modules, whatever is in a module, strongly interacts with one another. There are quite some relations within that code. But across modules, that will be a little bit less. And then again, most likely, the API of a given module is not that extensive. Another way to accomplish this is, of course, if you are using an IDE, either VS Code or you use Vim, something like that, then basically making sure that you have relevant files open is already providing quite a bit of context to an LLM, so that would help. In really complex cases, of course, what you can do is use retrieval augmented generation in order to provide extra context to the LLM as input. So that is something that we will talk about in the last session of this webinar series next week on Wednesday. So that would be my answer to that first question. Then, of course, checking generated results. Well, you have to check generated results anyway. I mean, that is something that you really can't avoid. For documentation, obviously, you really have to check mostly the semantic part, in the sense that most likely the API documentation, so the types of arguments and their default values and so on. This is something that any decent LLM will come up with pretty reliably. But of course, the semantics of what an argument means, of which values make sense or don't make sense, or generate errors, that is something that you would have to verify anyway. Similar for testing, of course, it will generate tests. So one check I definitely always do is use a test coverage tool in order to see what part of my code is subjected to testing and what part of my code is not tested yet or not tested at all. So that is some of the things I definitely do in those circumstances with respect to testing on the one hand and documentation on the other hand. Then there is another question, a more technical one, about the bash script. So this is not the log command you're referring to. The script itself contains a function definition, and the name of that function is log. It actually just generates its own log function, doesn't use anything that is part of your Linux distribution there.
Okay, thank you.
And then there is another question, sorry. Okay, how as for let's see, option to send. I think you can upload multiple files via the web interface. So that would definitely be an option. Also, of course, you can upload multiple files using some command line interface. So that's also possible. You can do that either using ChatGPT or AI chat. Those allow you to upload multiple files as well. And that, of course, is something that then you can actually script. So I think that now all questions have been answered.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Gertjan, for those answers, and thank you everyone for joining this webinar again. And we see you tomorrow for those who registered for getting a code review, if I remember well.
Indeed. That's the more depressing part. All right, thank you, and see you tomorrow.